Yeah, I mean, a lot of times the conversations that I have with young adults it's not focused on any particular substance, but it's just about whatever it is that we're looking at. We need you to be sober while you're participating in it so that we just have the opportunity to allow your brain to heal, your body to recover, and so that we have a clear understanding of.
Hello, I am B. Reeves with New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families. Thank you. All right. Welcome to another episode of Finding New Waters. I'm sitting here with our CEO, Justin McClendon, and we're very happy to have our special guest today, Therapeutic educational consultant. I hope I'm saying that right, Joanna Lilley. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you, guys.
So, Joanna, just for everybody listening and watching too, just tell us who you are, where you are, and exactly what you do, and then we'll just talk about it.
Do we have an extra hour? I'm just kidding. So I am a therapeutic consultant, like you said. I'm living in Northern Michigan, but I work with clients all over the US. My clients are young adults, so everybody over the age of 18. And I work with the families too, but the young adult is the primary client. And so when I am working with somebody, just for clarity and understanding, because nobody thinks a therapeutic consultant or thinks of that title when they're in need of help, I'm essentially an objective or independent party that vets treatment programs, resources, and then match makes those with those clients. And again, because my wheelhouse is working with young adults, that's the knowledge and understanding of what resources exist across the country. So maybe just a little.
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, because from my experience, I had personal experience working with a ed consultant when I was in high school, when I went off to school, and then fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, we needed her services again when I was in my early 20s. And she, her title was the same, I think, but she became more of a therapeutic consultant at that point. And so I guess one question I would have is what's the sort of demarcation line, and what are there, does everybody kind of do both, or are there people who do just one, or how does that work?
Well, you're asking the right person, because I certainly feel like I can be vocal about staying in your lane or having expertise. Okay. I do think that there are people that kind of cast a wider net. Maybe they are identified as an educational consultant, or that's the title that they want to use. And they do feel like they have expertise in college admissions. They do feel like they have experience in visiting therapeutic boarding schools or traditional boarding schools. They also have knowledge and understanding of some therapeutic programs that exist out there. And my lens with that is there are way too many programs, colleges, resources. Like, there is absolutely not enough time in the day to be able to also educate yourself on understanding developmental changes for these populations of young people that you're working with, and the parents that are obviously showing up to ask you for their support. So I say all of that, and that is why I'm honed in on only therapeutic, only young adult, because I feel like even that, being like that niched, is still overwhelming in terms of keeping a pulse on the changes that exist. Obviously kind of evolving with the fluidity of who's showing up on your door, what the trends are in terms of mental health or substance use. I mean, it is a revolving door, and I like to stay right where I am, and I will continue to stay right where I am, because I think that is my kind of preferred expertise in who it is I'm working with.
I hear you.
Joanna, so can you tell us a little bit about what does that process look like when the family member kind of reaches out and says, hey, our child is struggling and we may need to employ your services? What does that process look like?
I will start by just kind of front loading. I am obviously a unique individual. And so I think everybody's process looks a little bit different. So don't take my words as this is how all consultants operate.
Right.
I will say, first and foremost, I view the parents as the customer. At the end of the day, they're looking for value proposition. Are you going to be able to be hired to help find whatever it is that we need? I mean, obviously, that's like super broad and generic, but that's what parents are trying to understand. I also think that there's a relational piece to it too. Does this professional feel like they understand what it is that we're asking for, that they have knowledge and understanding in whatever it is that's complex that we're needing support in? And then also, are they just approachable? Are they trustworthy? Do I feel like just in this conversation, they have integrity, ethics, and are going to be transparent and honest in the process? So there's a lot of like subjective information gathering just as much as the objective information. How long are you going to work? What's the cost? Here's what we're working with. Do you help with insurance? Like all those types of questions. I gather all of this in about a 30-minute complimentary call with the parents. And then the next step, assuming that they've talked about a young adult that I feel like, okay, yeah, that's somebody I think I can work with based on what you've described. You haven't said anything that's egregious or frightening to me as a parent, like you might be a really mean person, because that's also my way of just gatekeeping as well. But assuming that first conversation goes well, then I actually engage with the young adult. That's also a part of the complementary process. And even when we're talking about somebody that's struggling with substance use, I need them to understand who I am, what I represent, and it also gives me a pulse on where they are in terms of their stage of change or willingness or motivation or just self-awareness. Yes, I absolutely feel like my life is a dumpster fire right now. I don't know how to fix that, but I understand that you're the type of person that might be able to help me. And then I'm also, again, going back to that subjective piece. Is this a young adult that I can relate with? Do I feel like I'm connecting with them? Do they understand who I am? Do they have any questions for me? Is there anything that they haven't shared with their parents that I need to know about that maybe also would kind of defer me to say, I'm not the best expert to work with you? But all of this process, all said and done, that's just the beginning. From there, then it goes into the paperwork. Send me any discharge summaries, psych testings, IEPs, like anything, releases to speak with your outpatient providers, fill out my intake forms. It's an obnoxiously long process intentionally, because I'm also not the crisis consultant that says, tell me what you need to know quickly. I'm going to match make you with programs, because I do think that there are people that do that and they do that well. That's not me. My process is really getting to understand who this young person is, not just what they need, but also what they want. Who are they fully, and who do they not understand that they are, but I can kind of see that vision. So it's a longer process, but all that, like once we get through that, then we start diving into like actually the researching and recommending resources process.
I've got a question. How does one become a therapeutic consultant? Well, I mean, what was your particular path, and is that normal? And otherwise, what's the more traditional path to get there?
I think the more traditional path, especially if you want to go that like quote unquote educational consultant route, is going to be somebody that maybe worked in education in some capacity, special education, school counseling, college admissions. And then I think the more therapeutic people ended up actually getting more of a mental health background, or that seems to be what the growing trend is. Way back when, let me just pause and say, way back when, I think it was a little bit of the wild, wild west. Anybody could be a consultant. They could say that they wear that hat. And then I think that's where we got some of the organizations that were really trying to rein that in. We do need a way to hold your feet to the fire to ensure that you're not, again, being unethical. And what is viewed as unethical in some of the larger international organizations is not transparency, dual relationships, earning money, right? Like fee for service or like fee splitting type experiences. So really just making sure we're not doing harm to the families or the clients that we're working with. But all that is to say, there are still people out there that aren't affiliated with any organizations. They have their own reasons why they're not. I don't think that there is a single path for anybody to be a consultant. Again, my lens is going to be very narrow and biased. For anybody that's stepping into the therapeutic space, I absolutely abhor you. You have to have a mental health background. It would actually be, in my mind, doing harm to any of the people that you're working with if you don't understand how addiction works, if you don't understand mental health diagnoses and what's an appropriate treatment modality to match a presenting issue. You need to be able to understand how to read a psych testing report, or why that would actually be appropriate for somebody to get done, or why it's irrelevant. And there's just like so much into it, but I think the short of it is there is no single path. There is no complete single governing body. And I know that because of that, that's where you get the wide range of who it is that you're working with, what they say they can do, and that quality of work.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it sounds like you probably, well, obviously working with young adults, I'm assuming you probably see a lot of co-occurring, whether it's primary addiction or primary mental health, or just, a combination of the two. Is there any kind of trends or anything? I wonder if you're seeing kind of recently, or we just had a conversation earlier about COVID. Interested to just see how the landscape, so to speak, has maybe shifted.
Yeah, I think really within the last 4 years since the pandemic, I've seen more anxiety-related diagnoses, so OCD specifically, or body dysmorphic disorder. Also seeing more eating disorder behaviors, whether it's an eating disorder diagnosis. I think there is comorbidity of somebody that's dealing with anxiety, eating disorder, and then substance use. And the substance use piece, to me, I think it's just goes without saying. Cannabis has blown up.
Yeah.
I think that it continues to be an issue where people don't understand the severity of the levels of THC and how it's being consumed by these young developing brains, and then that correlation with kind of psychotic episodes, and also how it is really flipping the switch for a lot of those that had pre-existing mental health issues that maybe parents didn't talk about. Again, it just depends on kind of the cultural upbringing or the focus and stigma around mental health within the family system. But we're just dealing with young people that are so acutely stressed out that it is making it impossible to understand how to slow down, understand how to like medicate in a healthy way, like getting right sleep, physically exercising, filling your body with the appropriate nutrition and supplements that it needs. I mean, just like the basic human like essentials. We're very far away from that because we're on a very fast moving train.
Yeah. And social media combined with pandemic. We talk, I feel like that ends up in conversation all the time. And I had a question. You mentioned the parents and what they have been willing to talk about, not willing to talk about. And you've been doing this long enough where you have seen baby boomer parents as well as Gen X parents and maybe even now millennial parents. But what do you see in the differences in terms of how they, what their kind of boundaries are with children or their, young adult children, and what they are willing to admit, what they're more, reticent to talk about? Is there any kind of glaring up, differences? Are there any?
I think that honestly is probably also a trend, kind of following off of Justin's last question. Within the last 4 years, I have parents that are not intentionally underreporting, but just really not understanding the severity of the situation. And I don't want to chalk that up to a parenting style. I also am attributing that to kind of this global grief, again, acute stress of what's to come and uncertainty for the future. And so I think we were just in it and didn't realize how bad it got. And then that became a normalized situation. And obviously I'm like grossly and being vague, like grossly talking in broad terms, but I think you can get the gist of it, where it's just a lot of parents didn't understand how serious things got. And that goes back to the cannabis use or their anxiety or the, school refusal or avoidance. So they're just using tech. I can't take that away, but it's like escalated to an extreme situation now where it is, it's hard for me to talk parents. Let me actually rephrase that. I don't want to say I'm talking them into getting help for their kid, because if they're reaching out to me, they do understand like something needs to change. But my onboarding process with parents now has also become more of a marathon. Not that it was ever a sprint. Again, kind of as I described earlier, my process working with young adults, it intentionally is slowed down. So I really am doing my due diligence of gathering information and understanding the full picture of the situation. But now it's even longer. Like my consulting agreement when I'm working with a family is either 3 months or 6 months. Pre-pandemic, the feedback that I got from families was, we don't need you for a full 6 months. We could have just used you for 3. Great. That's very valuable feedback. I'd like to move forward and actually offer that up to families that feel like they can let's get through this process. I view myself as being this conduit, only there for a short amount of time. Once the young adult's connected to the resources that they need to be connected to, I can phase out. If I can do that in 3 months, awesome. Now, on the flip side, in the last 4 years, as I've been offering those 3-month packages and parents are signing on, yeah, that sounds great. I'm getting to the end of the 3 months and I feel like we have not moved an inch. Right. It is painful. And I also should clarify too, I've kind of evolved in my practice where I realize some of those families on the front end are not, I can't be pulled into the weeds to become a parent coach, right? To become the couples therapist. And that's the last thing that I want to do. But a part of my like assessment process in the beginning is identifying what do they need. And so what I'm kind of front loading right out of the gate, and especially in the last few years, I'm here to help your young adult. So I'm like being really firm with my boundary of here's my lane, here's what I'm doing, here's my focus. And I also want you to work with these individual professionals to make sure we are collectively moving forward as a unit, rather than the parents saying, yes, let's do this, let's move forward. And then 2 weeks in, I realize parents are not on the same page. They're not unified. They're really exhausted or flooded. They need more time on the phone with me, but it's becoming more of a coaching conversation rather than a conversation about programs or resources. So it's a collaborative process too. And I do think that is, it is not tied to boomers or Gen Xers or millennial parents. It's just parents across the board.
Gotcha. Yeah. The cannabis thing. I mean, I'm old enough to have been in high school when it changed from being stems and seeds and made you laugh and groggy and hungry to where it was more like a psychedelic. And fortunately, when I got sober, I had no temptation to try any kind of California sober because that weed was so strong, it made me paranoid. But that was some years ago. And now when I was right before I got sober, the dabbing and the oil and the wax, all that stuff was coming around. And I mean, it's completely different now.
Yeah.
I mean, completely different. And I never, even when I was in active addiction, never believed weed was harmless. And I never was, I don't want to get into like a political discussion about it, but I always thought it was still a drug and believed that it was a gateway drug. And now it's almost more harmful than some of the drugs that were considered harder back when, weed was considered the gateway. Do you see that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think because it is, again, we're not going to go on the political soapbox, because it is normalized, it is economically kind of being pushed forward for a number of reasons. Parents are approving of it. I've actually had to change my intake form to ask students more specifically about what their cannabis use looks like. Same with whether or not, from the parent perspective, do you have a medical card? Does your young adult have a medical card? What are your values around substance use? Because I can't go into a conversation talking about, oh my gosh, he's drinking so much. Gosh, could we only, let me collect myself. I wish I had more of the like college students that just drank too much, because those clients are fun to have. And they're also an anomaly at this point.
Yeah.
It is like the full package of everything that you can get your hands on. Some of it's literally life or death. And then cannabis is one of those things where it just becomes this gray area depending on the parent's perspective or their political kind of forward-facing views.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's ironic that it somehow, even though it was illegal for, and still is in most states, admittedly, objectively changes the way you feel and perception, and you're intoxicated when you smoke it or eat it or whatever, ingest it in any way. Yet it is somehow considered completely harmless, which makes zero sense to me, especially as it's becoming legalized in certain states and there's a push for it to be legalized on a federal level. It's not like people smoke weed and just are like, should be operating heavy machinery. I mean, the same labels that are on pills are, it's, I don't know where it got lost in the shuffle that marijuana was harmless. It's strange.
Well, and, as you mentioned, I think it's not to sound like I don't know, whatever I was going to describe there. So, it's not the same marijuana that we used to smoke when we were kids. You know what I mean? That's just not, and these delta derivatives that are available now and the concentration of the THC in some of these products that are available, like it's not the same. And we, Joanna, we see a lot of it too at New Waters, so we do primarily detox, and we also do some really cool inpatient diagnostic assessments. And for both of those programs, we do see a lot of young adults that are struggling with cannabis-induced psychosis or a recent episode of psychosis that is likely induced by that overuse of cannabis. But we also see, the adult that has adopted this is not bad, it's being legalized, I can use this recreationally, or, I've heard and I've read the research that this will help me with my pain, or it helps me sleep better. So they've normalized it and they are using it. I think we could probably share the opinion that they're using it too much, right? Mm-hmm. And they're complaining that their mental health symptoms are being exacerbated by, but not connecting it, right? Still in this place of like, it's okay, this is helping me in this way. I can't seem to figure out why I'm increasingly more depressed, or I'm, more anxious than I've ever been, or, all of these things. So it seems to, and I may be a little biased in this, but it seems to be an emerging, problem that is maybe becoming more of an epidemic than we're given credit to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times the conversations that I have with young adults it's not focused on any particular substance, but it's just about whatever it is that we're looking at. We need you to be sober while you're participating in it, so that we just have the opportunity to allow your brain to heal. Yeah. Your body to recover, and so that we have a clear understanding of what's really going on. And then usually the buy-in at that point, right? Because it's not absolute. I need you to be, sober for the rest of your life. If you say that to an 18-year-old or a 28-year-old, depending on who you're asking, they're going to tell you to, screw off. Right. But the reality is, if I say, hey, while we're in this residential treatment program for 90 days, you have to be completely sober, because what it is that you're describing, the depression, right? Or whatever mental health symptoms you're having, we need an opportunity for you to really hit the reset in all areas of like wellness, right? That balance or homeostasis, sleep, physical exercise, nutrition, right? Going back to it all over again. It's like we need to kind of hit that baseline to see where things are at. And then ideally, right? Like that person has had the opportunity to reflect, to have insight, to experience what it's like to be substance free. And then maybe from their own perspective, choose what it is that they're going to do moving forward. Now, if somebody is kind of still in that place of like, no, it has nothing, denial, right? Like it has nothing to do with the substance use, then that's a part of their treatment journey, because they're just not ready yet. And they're going to continue to feel miserable, right? We know that. If you're smoking a shitload of weed and you're really anxious, but you're smoking because you're anxious, put it together, right? The anxiety is being fueled because of the weed. It's not actually helping. So, but that's one of those situations that's going to have to be a life lesson learned on their own timeline, but where we need to kind of hold their feet to the fire, or really the parents, right? Is that understanding and education around what marijuana looks like in 2024 and beyond.
Right. Absolutely.
Joanna, when you're traveling around checking out treatment centers, I say this, should preface this with knowing that every individual is different, every case is different. But are there any things that are must-haves that that are, or the reverse of that, a deal breaker that in terms of treatment centers for young adults?
Good question. I'll say one of the things that I'm looking for, it's not from a like objective perspective, like, oh, you have to have this one type of, mattress or a particular type of, whatever, pickleball courts, some shit like that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm like totally in the
You're good.
weeds. All of that stuff is irrelevant because at the end of the day, like we're talking about a roof over somebody's head,
Right.
a safe space for them to be where they're actually kind of being cracked wide open, doing the work internally to understand why is this happening to me. Again, I'm kind of like grossly summarizing and being vague about what kind of that treatment experience can look like for somebody, but really just getting to the core. Subjectively, what I'm looking for is a relationship between staff and participants where there is a mutual respect, not a like hierarchy of us versus them, because I think that sometimes plays out just a more controlled, unsafe environment. And when we're talking about the need to be doing some like true internal work, you need to be in a safe place. And I do think that that's something that I'm looking for. Is this just like a place where staff want to be, where the residents know the staff, where the staffs call the residents by name, and it just feels like not like a hunky-dory type situation, but like genuinely there's respect and kind of like a healthy environment. Beyond that, then I'm also just paying attention to the rest of my senses. What else do I see? What do I smell? What do I taste? Right? Like sometimes it's a matter of like, does it smell like this is definitely a boy's house? All right, guys, like somebody needs to like talk about hygiene.
Right.
Or, hey, somebody needs to do their laundry because it just permeating the entire property. But that doesn't speak about what a program represents, and definitely obviously that's indicated with who's in the program at that time. But I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, like I need to meet your staff, who is on staff. And I think the most important piece too is the relationship, and oftentimes that's also related to staff tenure, which I know right now sometimes, especially when we're talking about kind of some of those entry level or frontline staff, it's hard to maintain those people. But I think that there's an opportunity from an organizational perspective, if you invest in your staff and they also really respect the clients that are there and like want to be there no matter how hard it is, that's where you're going to have long-standing relationships. You're going to have that person who was a former client that went off and, was in recovery for a year before they came back. They worked, you paid for them to go back to school. Now they've got a degree. They're very invested in staying in the area. They're, key in the recovery community. They're branded, right, for your program. I think that just speaks volumes too about some of those privately owned spaces. But I kind of went on a little tangent there.
No, we wanted your tangent. Yeah. We wanted it.
I love that. And are there things, I know you mentioned a little bit, paying attention to your senses and things like that. Are there any like deal breakers if you're like, hey, I go to a treatment center and I see this, or I'm not seeing that relationship or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I'm looking for is also authenticity and transparency.
Yeah.
Right? Are you really doing the work that you say that you're doing? Do I feel comfortable calling you to talk about a client? Do I know other consultants or referents that have worked with you and they feel like, again, like what you're saying you do matches what is provided? And especially that's so important when we're talking about the complexity of like a drug-induced psychotic episode. Like, how do you navigate that? Because that's not just your typical like addiction treatment program. We're talking about medical oversight, true sophistication with mental health professionals, and the collaboration between the two. So all of that is to say, I am looking for communication and collaboration with staff. Are you willing to work with me knowing the client is going to be with you for potentially a short period of time? I'm also, let me think what else. I think really let me back up. I probably talk for a while, but the one thing that gets me the most is when somebody very clearly operates on the like, hey, if you refer to me, I'll refer to you. That is a very, I would like to say it's an old school referent mentality, but it's not. It still exists nowadays, hence patient brokering, fee splitting, like it's a real thing. I'm looking for people and programs that are not going to approach me about that process, because that will be the first, honestly, that's kind of the first and last nail in the coffin for me of like, I'm glad I saw your space. I'm probably never going to refer to you because that feels really unethical to me. And that also makes me believe that if I were to refer a client to you, that you would do some sort of backdoor dealing with the client going somewhere else without me being involved in the process. And I'm not neurotic in the sense of like, I have to be in control of my client's timeline or like their continuum or wherever it is that they're going and who they're connected to. What's more importantly is I'm trying to protect their well-being, making sure that there's no harm, no like ulterior agenda, which that's ultimately what is my biggest fear in kind of that unethical space. So I'm looking for integrity. And if you don't have it, that's where I have an issue.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's huge. Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder about if the people who are engaging in that, the kind of tit for tat, quid pro quo, if they just don't know any better, or if they were trained that way, or they're just kind of, doing the dirt, as they would say on The Wire. But yeah, it's we try to stay away from that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to your point, I think there is only one ethical way to do it, and that is that we're going to make referrals that are based on what's in the best interest of the client, and that's literally like period, full stop. That's that's it.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's a mark of a good professional and a good program in this field.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about how we go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that people do sometimes leave programs and start their own programs. And then that's sometimes where, again, as long as you continuously have that integrity that you carry with you, then that's where reference will also be like, okay, great, right? You worked at New Waters before. Now you're just launching your own local IOP. I'm interested in at least learning about it before I refer to it, but it ends up becoming a very, very small network, right, of quality over quantity in terms of resources. And so I think that that's where, again, we're all not trying to refer back and forth to the same programs or people, but it ends up becoming a fairly short list in the grand scheme of things. My number is, I tell people I've toured over 500 programs at places at this point. And every time I tour, I feel like my list becomes shorter overall, right? Just because like the total number of resources I've connected with continues to grow. Where I'm actually comfortable referring becomes a shorter list, because that integrity, the ethics, the like true intentionality, honesty, transparency in treatment is hard to come by.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I haven't been to that many treatment centers, and what I do is very different from yours. But one thing we definitely have in common is we do go to a lot of different treatment centers, and it's funny, the list that, especially for us, when we're sending people to that next level of care, no matter how many I go to, it does still kind of end up being, some variety of the same places that people, like, know, and trust, and that's kind of that's all we're interested in, is working with people we like, know, and trust,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that because, again, the list is short, but what I like to do in that matchmaking process is really identify, like, again, who is this person? Where did they come from culturally, right? Were they raised in the South? Do they want to stay in the South? Right. Or were they raised in New England and they're clueless, and like, actually North Carolina would be a fantastic cultural experience for them or academic experience for them. So I'm like just thinking about some of that, like, beyond the matchmaking of a program or the experience, but I'm also just thinking about that personality match and kind of what that young person may not realize that they need. And then sometimes I learn things about the family too, like, oh my gosh, we didn't know that there was a program in Raleigh. Like, that's fantastic, because actually we have family in that area, and that would be really convenient to know he's down there, we can come and visit. And so it just ends up kind of opening the door for conversations for parents to also expand where it is that they feel comfortable, knowing geographically that their child might be, and I say child, young adult, maybe setting roots for a little bit.
Yeah. You just made me think of something. How do you navigate with parents, and kind of what advice would you have to parents who may be listening to this? That would be a big section of who's listening is parents of young adults, for sure. Mm-hmm. But they got the kid, and I was this kid who was, I was I wouldn't say totally failure to launch because I did leave the house, but beyond that, wasn't very successful until I got a little older.
You launched and unraveled, B.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And but when the kid but especially the parents are just determined for this kid, they think if he could just graduate from college and get a job, everything would be fine. How do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Honestly, I think it goes back to, there's two things that I have to say on that. One, which is I can't lead a horse to water and make them drink. So if they are, it's almost like a cultish mindset. I know the parent, you said parents are listening. I'm not saying you're in a cult, parent, but what I'm saying is that sometimes there is this cognitive dissonance that we are so latched onto. If you just get that college degree, it'll change everything, right? If you just go back to school, if you just finish the semester, everything will be okay. But it's like your head is in the sand. No offense, again, for the people listening. The reality is you're going to continue to be forcing a very square peg in a round hole that is never going to become round. And if anything, you're shelling out a lot more money. We're wasting a lot more time, and we're digging a much bigger hole that ends up being harder for that young adult to dig out of. And I'm not saying it's like, oh gosh, this is painful. It's like, no, I've internalized that I am a failure. Not I have failed multiple times at school, at life, at jobs, at, whatever, trying to stay sober. It's I am a failure, right? So that shame is very entrenched. Going back to what I was saying earlier, if I don't have good rapport and relationship with the parents on the front end, there is absolutely no way I can ever entertain the conversation about pumping the brakes to go back to school or to finish the semester. And so if you go to my website, I've written articles on this. Why telling somebody like just finish the semester actually does more harm than it actually helps long-term for the young adult, or returning to college prematurely, like basically skipping steps in the treatment continuum. Like, well, they went to residential, they've been sober 90 days, school starts in 2 weeks. He's got to go back to Princeton. I'm sorry, what? Like, in what world do you think your young adult who just had 90 days in a bubble is going to be totally okay to remain sober and reintegrate back onto a college campus? Like,
yeah, I hear you. I'm proof of that. I mean, I went, when I tell my story, the academics are a big part of it. When I went from one, traditional boarding school to the other, which was not my choice, I developed that case of the wouldas, the couldas, the shouldas, the supposed to's. I'm supposed to be there. Then I go off to a big university in the SEC, not ready at all, get 0.0s and flunk out, and then convince my parents everything's gonna be fine, and then I'm gonna get back into. But this is after lying to them about everything, about the grades, pretending I'm in school for the next 3 months till the semester ends and the report card finally gets mailed out. And the thing is, every little failure, real or imagined, mostly real in this case, that was one more thing that I needed to drink over and use over just to cover it all up. And it was just this spiral, and it was never going to get any better because I wasn't prepared to do anything about it other than just internally complain and then cover it up my feelings with substances and act like everything was okay.
Yeah, you are my ideal client, B.
Yeah.
Like who you were as an emerging adult. I think in what you're describing too is exactly why I actually launched my podcast, which is called Success is Subjective, because as I launched my consulting practice and I was touring programs, I kept basically describing you, right? And what you just said, like went to school, academically, you were probably capable, right? But you just weren't college ready, right? Emotionally, mental health, substance use, like you were off to the races. Yep. Unfortunately, I got tired as I was touring programs of kind of sharing that same story. Like, here's my ideal client. Here's why I'm doing this. And everybody's like, oh, that was me. I felt like every program, even if it wasn't in the substance use field, it was like, yeah, I took a break from school. right? Like I just had this existential crisis where I was like, I don't want to do this. I need to figure out if I'm going to be in college, what do I want to do? So there was obviously a spectrum in that regard too, but I just felt like there was this consistent narrative of people being like, oh yeah, that was totally me. And so in an effort to try to collectively raise up this voice of it's okay to take a break, college can wait, success looks different for everybody. I mean, like, you know, the list kind of goes on. I started recording these podcast interviews, and I'm still waiting, B, for you to be a guest, but we'll circle back to that later.
Anytime. And I'll tell you right now, I want to, I'll save the rest of it, for your podcast, but sort of tying into what we talked about at the very beginning of this is that same therapeutic consultant who helped me go from one traditional boarding school to the other between my sophomore and junior years, helped me find a place. I went out to a place out in Montana when I was 22 it wasn't for long. It was only 3 weeks, but I just walked around the Bob Marshall National Forest and Glacier National Park, with this guy who was a part Crow Indian kind of spiritual guy. And I ended up coming back and getting my act together and doing really well. I went back to school and graduated at 25. And I say all that to say that, you know, consultants know what they're doing. And this consultant got me in the right place at the right time. And I came back and, you know, I graduated. Now, what I look back on and realize is I couldn't have a social life and an academic life. When I went back to school, I just really went, you know, really studied hard and didn't have much of a social life where I went to school. But I graduated and did really well. But, you know, I wouldn't have gotten there without that consultant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that, because I do think we get a lot of flack, right? And especially going back to the previous part of the conversation where it's like the person can do everything. They can do it all. Well, it sounds like that person really knew you and, like you said, what you needed at that time. And I think that's what we all always strive for. The other thing that I'll throw out there too is that 25 is actually young to get a college degree. And I think a lot of parents don't understand that too. And I love that you just talked about the distinction too of like being socially focused versus academically focused, because I do feel like the students that I end up working with the most, again, like my clientele is young adults, especially those that were in higher education and end up taking a break. Again, academically capable. Admissions department approved them. They got the like green light. You can study at our institution at whatever caliber level we have students study at. But if you don't focus on actually treating college like it's a full-time job, yes, I'm in class 15 hours a week. Well, are you putting in at least 25 hours outside of that, doing schoolwork, preparing ahead of time, all that? You still have ample time to socialize, but nobody understands that. And if you're going to college because it's all about the brand, oh my gosh, I got into my dream SEC school, I'm going, and then you get there and you're just like, again, off to the races, then academics very much is to the wayside, and you'll be lucky if you get a 0.0 GPA. I mean, honestly, that means that you actually stayed the course and didn't withdraw at some point in the semester. Like, that's impressive that you, again, I say that jokingly, tongue in cheek.
Yeah. But I mean, honestly, I was so paralyzed by everything. I didn't even have the wherewithal to go drop the class. I would just get a WF. I mean, it was pitiful. It had to happen. It happened the way it was supposed to happen.
Yeah,
that's right.
And 25 is okay. I think that other thing, again, going back to this, like, especially parents who have had a loved one take a break from school, end up in recovery, it's so important to focus on that solid foundation of recovery before returning to school. Because if you are quick to return to school, like too prematurely or not connected with enough resources or whatever, right? Like the collegiate recovery program, or you have X amount of months of sobriety and you've got, you're working your steps, whatever the case may be for that young person. I always strive for a year because that gives you enough time to like really have a solid foundation, but everybody's story or journey is a little bit different. But that said, somebody who's coming back with a year of recovery under their belt is going to be a hell of a lot more motivated to be focused on the academics. Yes, they're still going to be socially connected, but they're going to be connected to their peers in recovery. And that's an awesome community to be connected to. But those people have way better balance. They're getting sleep. They're going to meetings. They're working out. They're doing all the fun things, right? Sober fun things. but they're also taking their academics seriously. And that plays out when you're 23, 24, 26, 27, like that's okay. College isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. How does everybody find you?
Best way to find me is just my website, www.lilleyconsulting.com. Literally have links to a ton of articles, like I said, interviews, and link to the podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, Joanna. It was a blast.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you so much. And we will see you out there in the field soon.